Hello class, my name is Courtney Matthews, and today I'm going to be talking to you about when wealth becomes a spectacle, and this will be the wedding of Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez. The first thing I'm going to do today is talk about the wedding itself, kind of go over the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and then after that I'm going to talk about what makes the wedding controversial. I'm going to go over the cost of the wedding, the guests that attended, as well as the environmental impact of the wedding itself, and then I'll close up the conversation by talking about why is this wedding an ethical dilemma and kind of tie it back into some of the course materials that we've learned this year so far. So on to our first order of business, the wedding itself. Now, what are some details regarding it? The wedding was for Jeff Bezos, who is currently the fourth richest man in the world, and Lauren Sanchez. Lauren became famous as a TV broadcaster. She later became a pilot and actually founded her own aviation company. They met and began dating in 2019. This wedding celebration was hosted in Venice, Italy on July 27th, 2025, and it had roughly 3 days of festivities. Over 200 star-studded guests attended. Now we're going to move on to what makes this wedding controversial. Number one, cost. So the first thing that makes this wedding controversial is the cost itself. So overall, news outlets estimate that this wedding cost between $20 and $65 million. There is some variance on the cost based on the news outlet doing the estimation, but these are roughly what multiple news outlets came up with. So throughout this report, I'm going to use a baseline of about $50 million for the cost of this wedding, just because that was the number that seemed to be reported the most. So excuse me while I glance down at my notes for some of this, but Lauren Sanchez's dress is the first expense I want to highlight today. It cost roughly about $300,000. It was a custom-made piece from Dolce & Gabbana. Catering is another expense to take into consideration. It was about $1.1 million. The 3-star Michelin chef, Fabrizio Melino, he actually closed down his restaurant for 4 entire days to cater to the wedding party guests and then the bride and grooms themselves. Swag bags were also a very maligned item within the media that were provided to guests that attended the wedding. Estimates on these swag bags really range. They're either between $200 or $800. So if we go on the low end, with them having about 200 guests, that'd be about $40,000 for the swag bags. But if we go on the high end, which was $800, it'd be about $160,000 just for swag. Accommodations were in multiple places throughout the city, but Jeffrey Bezos did actually shut down the Amman Hotel, and so he paid almost $1 million. 3 other costs I think are important to mention. Venice is a city that is literally floating, so you need water taxis to get from place to place throughout the city. Jeff and Lauren rented private water taxis that they and all of their guests could use for their duration in Venice, and it cost them about $270,000. Security for the event was the largest expense, and considering how many celebrities attended, it's unsurprising. It cost about $3 million. The last thing I want to mention is that Lauren and Jeff did goodwill donations for the city of Venice, a private university in Venice, and those totaled $3.6 million. The second controversial issue that kept coming up about this wedding was the actual guests who attended, and many of them were celebrities. Oprah, Usher, Tom Brady, Sydney Sweeney, the Kardashians, the list goes on and on. The last big controversy surrounding this wedding is its environmental impact. 96 private jets flew celebrities into this wedding. Private jets are huge polluters. They're 5 to 14 times more polluting, depending on their size, than a commercial airliner. So the fact that 96 of these planes flew into Venice created a huge carbon output that otherwise would not have happened. The issue that ties into this is that Venice is literally a floating city. As ocean levels continue to rise because of global warming, Venice may eventually become completely overtaken by water. So the fact that Jeff and Lauren decided to host their wedding there, that 96 private jets flew in, is just not good optics for them. Now that we've covered, the controversies surrounding the wedding, the costs, the A-list guests who attended, as well as the impacts on global warming and climate change, why does this event pose an ethical dilemma, and how does it do so? An ethical dilemma, I've always had it described to me as a situation that if you view it from different lenses, may seem right or it may seem wrong. So I first want to look at it through a billionaire's lens. Maybe try to see the situation from what Jeff and Lauren were thinking. So Cooper, who is the author of our textbook, talks about moral rules in one of the first chapters. She says that the moral rule level level is the first level at which ethical questions are raised. And when you're doing a moral rule level, you're typically using a maxim or a well-known phrase to justify your action to yourself. So in this situation, Jeff and Lauren may have been thinking, we've got to take care of number one. That's a maxim that we use to say you have to take care of yourself because no one else will. Number two, another maxim that I hear a lot is, I've worked hard for my money, so, and Jeff could think to himself that he worked hard for all that money he's accumulated. So maybe in his mind, it's a huge justification to be able to have the wedding of his and Lauren's dreams. Another thing I do want to mention is, even though this wedding did cost $50 million, that is just 0.02% of Jeff Bezos' wealth. If you were an average American and you're looking at 0.02% of your wealth, it's the equivalent of spending about $250. Would we shame someone else for spending $250 on their wedding? I don't think so. I think we'd actually be like, oh my gosh, you saved so much money. It's kind of an ethical dilemma here, because why are we shaming Jeff Bezos and Lauren when maybe we wouldn't do that to an average American? Another one of the ideas that Cooper brings up in her textbook is subjective responsibility and roles. Subjective responsibility is our feelings. So maybe an individual's feelings about responsibility. These feelings emerge from the socialization process. People exercise responsibility and are held responsible in society when they accept and carry out well-defined roles. For example, as an oldest child, you may be given more responsibility because you have to care for little ones. You're setting that example. So you may have a little bit extra responsibility on your shoulders because of your role as that oldest child. What's interesting about this, though, is that it seems that these roles can create kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So external expectations may be internalized through the socialization process and become part of our role. When we're putting ourselves in Jeff and Lauren's shoes, they have this role of being a billionaire, of being incredibly wealthy. In their mind, they're trying to play and act according to this role. And one thing I wanted to bring up is how, as a culture, we look at billionaires. If you look at your screen, you'll see a few very famous examples of billionaires and movie depictions. We have Jay Gatsby, who was known to throw very lavish parties. We have Leonardo DiCaprio's character in The Wolf of Wall Street. He also threw very lavish parties. We have Lex Luthor, who is an evil man who goes up against Superman. He's a billionaire. We have Edward Norton's character in Knives Out. He's literally a murderer. And then we have Meryl Streep's character in Don't Look Up, who's literally a billionaire president, just kind of beat-bopping around, serving herself. So if we're thinking that this is what's normal for a billionaire, throwing parties, not having a ton of morals, I mean, Jeff Bezos and Lauren are kind of fulfilling this role, fulfilling this societal expectation that's placed upon them. And not only that, Lauren and Jeff, when you look at these characters that are portrayed to us in the media that at their core are pretty evil and pretty bad people, they may think we are doing so much better than these billionaires. However, if we were to look at the other side of the coin, step out of Jeff and Lauren's shoes, put on an everyday person's shoes, or maybe a person living in poverty, I think that idea of being a good billionaire changes. Utilitarian theory we discussed in week 1 of this class. It was popularized by John Stuart Mill, and it can be defined as the greatest good for the greatest number. So think about 210 people were at this party. There's 8 billion people in the world. Is giving 210 people a really cool weekend really a great use of $50 million of money when there's 8 billion people in the world? On top of that fact, I really want to highlight an area of the world where there's actual famine. It's one of the only places in the world where there's an active famine happening right now, and it's entirely man-made, meaning that this famine was caused by individuals' actions. Right now in Sudan, there's roughly 12 million people suffering from hunger because of this famine, and 5 million of them are children, so about half, $75 can feed a family of 5 for an entire month. If Jeff Bezos and Lauren had used this $50 million towards hunger relief in Sudan, they could have fed over 650,000 Sudanese families for an entire month. Moreover, according to Preston's definition, ethics is what is right, what is fair, just, or good, what we ought to do, not just about what is the case or what is acceptable. I just talked to you about how socialization can create a self-fulfilling prophecy based on the role that we're forced into or that we play at work or in life. Just because the role is there doesn't mean you have to live up to that role. You can reject that role and give your wealth away. Bill Gates and Melinda Gates, for example, they plan to give away the majority of their wealth before they die. Jeff Bezos and Lauren Sanchez, as far as I know, have not pledged to do that. So just because something is the norm doesn't necessarily mean you should act by that norm. Gibson Winter, his definition of ethics is the science of human intentionality. If we were to look at the Sanchez-Bezos wedding, the intentions behind it seem to just be to throw a really good party. Again, is that ethical? Is that moral? Is that good? It might be good for them and the 210 people that attended the party, but then again, if we step back and put ourselves in the shoes of a very vulnerable person, this wedding just seems like a gross display of wealth and privilege. Another idea that Cooper brings up is her idea of law versus teleological ethics. So law is the bare minimum a person should do, and for Cooper, law is here, but ethics is way up here. Law is absolutely beneath ethics. Lauren and Jeff, when they were planning this wedding, they didn't break any laws. They didn't do necessarily anything illegal, but was what they were doing ethical? Because, being legal and being ethical are two different standards. Being ethical is a higher standard. Cooper says teleological ethics is concern for the ends or consequences of one's actions. And when we think about the cost of this wedding, the gross celebrity, and then finally the environmental and ecological impact of this wedding, it does not seem that Lauren or Jeff thought their actions through. So I have three final ideas that just kind of pull together why I think this wedding was largely unethical. Number one is Cooper's idea of responsibility to citizenry. Cooper explains that being ethical and being responsible to citizens would happen if men saw clearly, thought rationally, acted disinterestedly, and benevolently. I think that these actions that Jeff and Lauren took were definitely to get attention. It doesn't seem that their wedding was a disinterested choice. I think they were definitely attention seeking. And I don't think the wedding was kind. Again, they only spent $3.6 million in charitable contributions, while they spent another $53 million on gifts for themselves and good experiences for their guests, who are already mainly incredibly wealthy and privileged. Are they the ones that really need help? Additionally, I don't think Jeff and Lauren put on a veil of ignorance, which is an idea popularized by Rawls in our textbook, when planning their wedding. If a person puts on a veil of ignorance, they forget where they are in the social structure, where they stand gender-wise. They forget what privileges and disadvantages they have, and they act as if they were the lowest person in society so that the needs of the less fortunate are kept in mind. This wedding definitely was a billionaire's wedding. It's very clear that Lauren and Jeff knew what means they had behind them, and they didn't care what the consequences were because they could afford it. Therefore, they did not put on the veil of ignorance before making any decisions. The final idea I want to talk to you today is Cooper's idea of prescriptive decision making. Cooper argues that a person with important fiduciary responsibilities should make ethical decisions, and the way they can make those ethical decisions is by employing that prescriptive decision-making model. And to do that, you have to recognize a problem and you have to design a course of action to resolve it. I think when Jeff and Lauren were planning their wedding, if they would have kept this in mind, they might have been able to make it a bit more ethical. Like I said earlier, they only spent about $3 million in charitable contributions. I think if they would have spent a more equal amount of money, maybe even more money in charitable contributions than what their wedding cost them, they could have, resolved this ethical dilemma and made their wedding a lot more palatable to the everyday people on the ground like me. They should have asked themselves, how can I change the optics of this situation before planning and carrying out the wedding that they did. So class, this ends my video about the Lauren Sanchez and Jeff Bezos wedding. I hope I was able to present the arguments in this ethical dilemma to each of you. If you want to check out my discussion questions, they are linked in the post for this. If you just comment to a few by the end of the week, hopefully we can all get a great grade.